If you had walked into any general headquarters in Washington City in the autumn of 1861 and asked who would win the American Civil War, not a single officer in the room would have given you the name Ulysses S. Grant. If you had pressed them, they would have laughed. They would have told you he was a washed-up clerk, a disgraced former captain who had been forced to resign his commission because he could not stop drinking. They would have told you he was a man who spent his days measuring wood planks in his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois. A man who had failed at every single thing he had tried in civilian life. They had no idea what was coming. This is the story of a man who compiled one of the most relentless winning streaks in military history. Ulysses S. Grant took command of a Union army that had been paralyzed by cautious, overthinking generals, and he proceeded to win every major campaign he undertook. He captured 3 separate Confederate armies in the field, a feat no other commander on either side of the war would match. He forced the capitulation of the rebellion and reunited a shattered nation. By the end of the war, he was the most respected military figure in the Western world. But his reputation was impossible. How does a man everyone dismissed as a hopeless drunk, a man who had failed so completely in peacetime that he was universally pitied, become the architect of total victory? How does a commander who refuses to retreat, who seems to grasp the grand geometry of a continent-spanning war when his superiors cannot, do it without losing a single campaign? The answer is not found in a bottle. The answer is not found in blind luck. The answer is found in a brutally simple, spatially ruthless mechanism of war that he developed in the mud and the freezing rivers of the Western theater. Before you can understand the mechanism, you have to understand the wound. You have to understand the man who stood behind the counter in Galena, Illinois, in April of 1861, weighing scraps of leather and watching the nation tear itself apart. Ulysses S. Grant was not a stranger to failure, but his failures were born of a profound, paralyzing sensitivity. He had graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1843, a middling student who excelled only in mathematics and horsemanship. He served with distinction under General Zachary Taylor during the Mexican-American War, where he learned the value of aggressive march and fight tactics, observing how Taylor moved quickly, attacked decisively, and lived off the land. Grant carried those lessons deep into his chest. He stayed in the army after the war, serving in the lonely, desolate outposts of California and Oregon. It was there that the wound opened. Separated from his wife and children by thousands of miles of ocean, wilderness, and slow-sailing ships, Grant was desperately, achingly lonely. He was a quiet, deeply devoted family man, forced into isolation on the frontier. The officers' mess at Fort Humboldt was a brutal, heavy-drinking environment. Grant, a man of intense emotions and a fragile constitution for alcohol, began to drink. He did not drink like a man seeking pleasure. He drank like a man trying to numb a profound, howling grief. His commanding officer, Colonel Robert Buchanan, a harsh disciplinarian who despised Grant's quiet demeanor, caught him off duty in a compromised state. Buchanan gave him a choice. He could resign his commission, or he could face a court-martial and the public ruin of his name. It was May of 1854. Grant packed his trunks, left the army, and went home to Missouri. The next 7 years were the darkest of his life. He tried to farm a plot of land he called hardscrabble, clearing the stumps with his own bleeding hands. But he could not make it pay. He tried selling real estate in St. Louis. He failed. He walked the streets in his worn, shabby military overcoat, occasionally accepting loans from friends just to feed his wife and 4 children. He was so poor he had to pawn his gold watch. He was so desperate he sold firewood on the street corners, hauling it himself in a borrowed wagon. He finally swallowed his pride and moved to Galena, Illinois, to work in a leather store owned by his father and managed by his younger brothers. They did not give him an ownership stake. They gave him a salary. He was a clerk, measuring hides and keeping the books. Grant was 38 years old. He had no military prospects, no money, and no future. He was widely known among the army elite as a man who could not handle his liquor. And yet, the sheer crushing weight of his failure had forged something iron in him. He had hit the absolute bottom. He had faced total financial ruin and the destruction of his self-respect. When the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter in April of 1861, Grant did not hesitate. He knew he had to go back. He did not demand a high rank. He did not demand a Major General's stars. He wrote to the Adjutant General of the Army in Washington, offering his services in any capacity. He wrote to the Governor of Ohio, who was organizing regiments. He wrote to anyone who would read his letters. His offers were met with silence. Washington ignored him. The War Department did not even reply. But the state of Illinois was a chaotic mess. Governor Richard Yates was drowning in the logistical nightmare of raising, equipping, and training volunteer regiments. The volunteers were unruly, undisciplined, and entirely resistant to authority. They were farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers who had elected their own officers and refused to take orders from anyone they did not respect. The governor needed someone to whip them into shape, and he was desperate enough to take a chance on the quiet, shabby-looking man from the leather store. Grant was appointed a colonel of the 7th District Regiment of Illinois Volunteers. He was given command of a chaotic, unruly camp of men near Springfield. Within weeks, he had instituted brutal discipline, enforced sanitary conditions, and transformed the camp into a functioning military base. The volunteers respected him because he did not scream, he did not posture, and he did not beat his chest. He simply looked them in the eye, gave clear orders, and followed his own rules. He was promoted to brigadier general. He was given command of the District of Southeast Missouri. He was handed a theater of war that the High Command in Washington considered a backwater. It was a vast, tangled, swampy wilderness of rivers and bluffs, completely unlike the neat, manicured battlefields of Europe. It was in this backwater, far from the eyes of the press and the meddling generals in Washington, that Grant would forge his mechanism. To understand what Grant did, you have to understand what everyone else was doing. The conventional military wisdom of the era, perfected in Europe and rigidly adhered to by both Union and Confederate commanders, demanded that an army advance only when its supply lines were completely secure. A general was taught that he must establish a chain of depots, fortified bases stretching back to his main source of ammunition and food. If the army advanced, the supply line had to stretch behind it like a thick, unbreakable rope. If the enemy threatened that rope, the army had to halt, turn around, and protect its supplies. General George McClellan, the commander of the Union Army of the Potomac, was the high priest of this doctrine. McClellan had an army of over 100,000 men, perfectly equipped, beautifully drilled, and completely paralyzed by his obsession with supply lines and his terror of leaving his depots unprotected. McClellan would not move unless he had perfect intelligence, perfect roads, and perfect security. He won no battles. Grant looked at this doctrine and saw a trap. He understood that an obsession with supply lines did not protect an army. It shackled it. It made generals timid. It made them fight to protect their wagons instead of fighting to destroy the enemy. Grant also understood something else, something drilled into him by his years of failure. He understood that the enemy was just as scared, just as hungry, and just as confused as he was. He did not believe in the grand, romantic European vision of war, where brilliant generals moved battalions across a map like chess pieces. He believed in a brutal, grinding, relentless application of pressure. His mechanism was simple, but in the context of 1862, it was revolutionary. The Grant mechanism operated on 3 pillars. First, the continuous advance. Grant believed that an army must never stop moving forward. A retreating army loses morale and surrenders ground. An army that digs in and waits surrenders the initiative. Grant intended to always dictate the tempo of the engagement. Second, the logistics of the land. Grant intended to cut his own supply line on purpose. He would order his men to leave their heavy wagons behind, carry their ammunition and a few days of rations in their knapsacks, and live off the country they marched through. Foraging stripped the enemy's countryside of food and allowed the Union Army to move twice as fast as a tethered, wagon-bound force. Third, the forward pivot. Instead of retreating to protect a supply line when attacked, Grant would attack in the opposite direction, pushing deeper into enemy territory, forcing the enemy to react to his movement rather than the other way around. He would make the enemy fight on his terms. in his chosen geography, at his chosen tempo. This is the mechanism he would test at a frozen, miserable fortress on the Cumberland River. The geography of the Western Theatre in the winter of 1862 was a nightmare of water and mud. The Tennessee and Cumberland rivers sliced straight down into the heart of the Confederacy. They were the invasion highways of the era, deep enough for heavy ironclad gunboats, wide enough to bypass the terrible muddy roads. The Confederates knew this. To block the Cumberland River, they had built a massive earthwork fortification called Fort Henry on the east bank. To block the Tennessee River, they had built Fort Donelson on the west bank. Fort Donelson was the stronger of the two. It sat on a bluff 100 feet above the frozen Cumberland River. It was protected by a dense abattis of felled trees with sharpened branches and a perimeter of trenches dug into the hard, frozen earth. The fort was commanded by General John Floyd, a politically appointed officer with no military talent. But the actual defense was organized by General Gideon Pillow, a pompous, overconfident man who despised Grant and believed the Union Army was composed of cowards who would break at the first sign of resistance. Pillow's overconfidence was exactly the flaw Grant's mechanism was designed to exploit. Pillow believed that a fort's strength lay in its walls. He believed that if he sat behind his earthworks, the Union Army would have to charge them, fail, and retreat. Pillow did not understand that the Union Army, moving without wagons, would not need to retreat. He did not understand that the fort was not an island. It was a trap. Fort Donelson had one fatal geographic flaw. It was surrounded by a crescent of hills, and the only road leading out of the fort, the only avenue of escape, ran straight south through a narrow valley. Grant saw this immediately. He did not need to storm the walls. He needed to seal the valley. On February 11th, 1862, Grant ordered his army of 15,000 men to march away from their river transports and their heavy supply wagons. They carried 3 days of rations in their knapsacks. The temperature dropped below freezing. A freezing rain turned the roads to slick sheets of ice. The men slipped, fell, and cursed, but they moved fast. They covered 20 miles in 2 days, completely bypassing the Confederate cavalry screen. Grant had his gunboats shell the fort from the river, keeping Pillow's attention fixed on the water, while his infantry swung around to the south. Pillow realized what was happening too late. On February 14th, Pillow made his move. He ordered his entire garrison to burst out of the fort's southern gate, attack the Union forces blocking the road, and punch a hole through to Nashville. He believed he could break Grant's army, clear the road, and march to safety. The Confederate assault hit the Union right flank with devastating force. The Union lines, cold, hungry, and tired, bent backward. Regiments broke and ran. The road to Nashville was wide open. Pillow had won. He had broken the line. All he had to do was march his men through the gap and escape. But Pillow's overconfidence and his rigid adherence to old doctrine betrayed him. When his men broke the Union line, they stopped to loot the Union camps, tearing apart the knapsacks the Union soldiers had dropped when they fled. Pillow, watching from the rear, convinced himself that the victory was so complete that he should pull his men back inside the fort to rest before marching out. He surrendered the road he had just captured. He retreated back into the trap. When Grant heard that his right flank had collapsed, he did not panic. He did not order a retreat to the riverboats to protect his line of communication, as any conventional general would have done. He looked at the terrain. He saw that the Confederate troops had pulled back inside the fort, leaving their outer trenches empty. He turned to his division commander, a rough, loud general named John McClernand, and gave the order that would define his career. He told his men to retake the trenches, not to fall back, but to push forward and seal the road. The mechanism snapped into action. The Union soldiers, carrying no heavy packs, light on their feet, charged back up the hills. They retook the outer trenches. They pushed deeper, surrounding the fort completely. The escape route was sealed. The temperature dropped further. Inside the fort, the Confederate troops were freezing, demoralized, and surrounded. The river gunboats were shelling the inner works. Pillow handed command to General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who took his cavalry and fled through a frozen swamp, but the infantry was trapped. General Floyd, The overall commander boarded a boat and escaped, taking 2 regiments with him. The command fell to General Simon Bolivar Buckner. Buckner knew the situation was hopeless. He sent a messenger through the lines under a flag of truce, asking Grant for terms of surrender. Buckner and Grant were old friends. They had served together in the army, and Buckner had even loaned Grant money when he was destitute in New York. Buckner expected a gentleman's agreement. He expected Grant to offer parole, allowing the Confederate officers to keep their sidearms and the men to go home with a promise not to fight again. It was the polite European way to end a siege. But Grant was not fighting a polite European war. He was fighting a total war. He sat down in his frozen tent, took a piece of paper, and wrote a reply that echoed across the continent. He wrote that no terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender could be accepted. He proposed to move immediately upon their works. Buckner, humiliated and trapped, was forced to accept. He surrendered over 12,000 men, the largest capture of an army on the North American continent up to that point. Grant had not lost a campaign. The mechanism had worked. If you are starting to see how this works, if you are beginning to grasp how a man labeled a drunk could read the geography of a battlefield and exploit the rigid, overconfident doctrines of his enemies, then hit subscribe. We cover military history like this every week, breaking down the exact spatial geometry and the human decisions that reshaped the world. Fort Donelson proved the continuous advance could shatter a static defense. But the question remained, could Grant's mechanism survive a fortress that could not be surrounded, a geographic nightmare that defied every rule of conventional logistics? He would soon face the most impregnable position on the continent. After the victory at Fort Donelson, Grant was the hero of the North. The newspapers printed his initials, U.S., and called him Unconditional Surrender, Grant. But the fame did not last. In April of 1862, Grant was surprised by a massive Confederate attack at Shiloh. His army was nearly routed, and though he rallied and won the battle, the casualties were staggering. Over 13,000 Union soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The press screamed that Grant had been drunk, that he had been caught unprepared, that he was a butcher. Washington politicians demanded his removal. General Henry Halleck, his superior, sidelined him, stripped him of his direct command, and made him a deputy. For months, Grant sat in a tent with nothing to do, contemplating whether he should resign. The old whispers about his drinking returned. He was saved only by the fact that Halleck was a terrible field commander. Halleck was promoted to Washington, and Grant was given back his army. He was ordered to take Vicksburg. Vicksburg, Mississippi, was the key to the Confederacy. President Abraham Lincoln said that Vicksburg was the key, and the war could never be won until the key was turned. The city sat on a high bluff, overlooking a sharp hairpin turn in the Mississippi River. The Confederates had fortified the bluff with massive artillery batteries. Any Union ship trying to run the river would be blasted out of the water. The river itself was impossible to bridge. To the east of the city, the terrain was a tangled, swampy nightmare of bayous, creeks, and thick underbrush. To the north, the ground was flooded. To the west, it was a vast flooded bottomland. The city was considered impregnable. It had repelled a massive naval bombardment. It had repelled a direct overland advance. It had repelled an attempt to dig a canal to bypass the river bend. Grant spent the winter of 1862 staring at the city, trying every conventional approach, and failing. The high command in Washington was losing patience. Grant's old nemesis, John McClernand, the politician-turned-general from Fort Donelson, was lobbying Lincoln to give him an independent command to take Vicksburg, bypassing Grant entirely. Grant was under immense pressure. He had to move, and he had to win. He looked at the map and made a decision that every military engineer in the country called madness. He decided to run his supply transports past the Confederate guns, march his army down the west bank of the river, cross below Vicksburg, and attack the city from the south. This meant he would have to cut his supply line entirely. He would have no reinforcements, no ammunition, and no food coming from the north. He would live off the land, or he would starve. It was the ultimate test of his mechanism. On April 16th, 1863, the operation began. The Union transports, loaded with supplies, steamed down the Mississippi River toward the Confederate batteries at Vicksburg. The night was moonless, but the Confederates had lit bonfires along the riverbank, illuminating the ships. The Confederate artillery opened fire. The river erupted in a storm of iron. The ships took direct hits. The decks were splintered. The noise was deafening, but the ships were moving fast, and the Confederate gunners had to depress their barrels to hit targets at the base of the bluff, a difficult angle. Most of the shots went high. One transport was sunk, but the rest made it through. The supply line was established on the south side of the river. Grant now had his supplies. He ordered his army of 40,000 men to march down the west bank. The march was brutal. The men carried no tents, no baggage, and no heavy knapsacks. They carried their rifles, their cartridges, and hardtack. They foraged the countryside, taking horses, mules, pigs, and corn from the local farms. They moved fast, covering 15 miles a day through deep mud and thick swamps. The Confederate commander, General John Pemberton, was paralyzed by confusion. He expected Grant to retreat to protect his supply line. When he realized Grant was advancing without, he did not know what to do. He believed Grant was either a fool or a madman. The Confederate President, Jefferson Davis, had ordered Pemberton to hold Vicksburg at all costs. Pemberton was a cautious, indecisive commander. He sat in his fortress, waiting for Grant to attack the impregnable defenses. Grant did not attack the defenses. He executed his forward pivot. Instead of marching straight up to the fortress, he swung his army wide to the east, bypassing the city entirely, and attacked the railroad junction at Jackson, Mississippi. Jackson was the supply hub for Vicksburg. Grant's men overran the town, tearing up the railroad tracks, burning the supply depots, and cutting the Confederate telegraph lines. Pemberton, finally realizing he was cut off, marched his army out of Vicksburg to try and catch Grant in the open. But Grant was already moving. He turned his army west toward Pemberton and met him at a crossroads called Champion Hill. Champion Hill was the decisive battle. Pemberton had 20,000 men. Grant had 30,000. But Grant's men were moving fast, light, and aggressive. The terrain was a series of steep ridges and deep ravines, covered in thick forest. Pemberton deployed his men in a defensive line on the crest of the hill. Grant ordered a frontal assault. The Union lines charged up the slopes, taking heavy casualties. The Confederate line held. But Grant did not stop. He sent a division under General James McPherson swinging around the Confederate flank. The flanking force hit the Confederate right side, which was anchored on a deep ravine. The Confederate line buckled. Pemberton ordered a retreat, but the retreat turned into a rout. The Confederate army was shattered, fleeing back toward Vicksburg. The road was open. Grant pursued the broken Confederate army all the way back to the trenches around Vicksburg. He assaulted the works twice, and both times his men were thrown back with terrible losses. The Union army settled in for a siege. For 40 days, the Union artillery shelled the city. The Confederate soldiers and civilians were starved out, living in caves dug into the hillsides, eating rats and mule meat. On July 3, 1863, Pemberton asked for terms. Grant, remembering the political backlash after Fort Donelson, initially offered to parole the prisoners. But Washington insisted on unconditional surrender. Pemberton, his army starving and his men deserting, had no choice. On July 4, 1863, he surrendered the city and over 29,000 men. The Mississippi River was in Union hands. The Confederacy was cut in half. Grant had not lost a campaign. He was promoted to Major General, but the war was not over. The Confederate Army in the East, under General Robert E. Lee, was winning. Lee had defeated every Union general sent against him. The Union public was exhausted. The casualty lists were staggering. Lincoln needed a man who would not retreat. In March of 1864, Lincoln appointed Grant to the rank of Lieutenant General, a rank previously held only by George Washington. Grant was given command of all Union armies. He did not go to Washington to sit behind a desk. He established his headquarters in the field, directly with the Army of the Potomac. His opponent was Robert E. Lee, a brilliant tactician, a legend in the South, and a man who had never been defeated in a major campaign. Lee was the master of the defensive battle. He had humiliated the Union Army at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. He was overconfident. He believed he could outmaneuver any general in the Union Army. Lee's overconfidence was built on a single rigid assumption. He believed that Union generals would always retreat after a bloody battle. He believed that if he inflicted enough casualties, the Union public would demand an end to the war, and the Union Army would withdraw. Lee fought a war of attrition, but his attrition was psychological. He wanted to break the will of the Union government. Grant understood this. Grant knew that Lee was fighting a political war, but Grant was not fighting a political war. He was fighting a total industrial war. Grant's mechanism for the overland campaign was a variation of his continuous advance. He called it the sidestep. He would attack Lee, take heavy casualties, and when Lee dug in, Grant would not retreat. He would move his army to the left, around Lee's flank, forcing Lee to pull back and fight again. Grant knew he had more men, more supplies, and more industry. He could afford to take casualties. Lee could not. Every Confederate soldier lost was irreplaceable. Every Union soldier lost was replaced by a new recruit from the north. The overland campaign began in May of 1864. The terrain was the wilderness of Spotsylvania, a dense, tangled forest of second-growth trees and thick underbrush. It was the worst possible terrain for an army of over 100,000 men. Visibility was limited to a few yards. The artillery was useless. The lines were a chaotic mess. Lee attacked Grant in the wilderness, and the battle was a bloodbath. The dry leaves in the forest caught fire, and the wounded men burned to death in the flames. The fighting was close, brutal, and hand-to-hand. The Union Army took 17,000 casualties in 2 days. It was a tactical defeat. The Army of the Potomac had been stopped. But Grant did not retreat. He did not withdraw north to regroup. He ordered his men to march south, around Lee's right flank, towards Spotsylvania Courthouse. The sidestep was in motion. Lee anticipated the move and rushed his army to Spotsylvania, digging in behind a massive earthwork called the Mule Shoe. Grant threw his army against the Mule Shoe, and the fighting was some of the most savage of the war. The men fought in the trenches with bayonets, clubbed muskets, and bare hands for 20 hours straight in a pouring rain. The casualties were astronomical. The Union Army lost another 18,000 men. The newspapers in the North screamed in horror. They called Grant a butcher. They demanded his removal. Lincoln, under immense political pressure, stood by his general. He said he could not spare this man. He fights. Grant sidestepped again. He moved south to Cold Harbor. The terrain was open, flat, and easily defensible. Lee had dug in behind massive earthworks. Grant, frustrated by the slow progress and the heavy casualties, ordered a massive frontal assault. It was a disaster. The Union Army lost 7,000 men in less than an hour. The men pinned themselves to the ground, digging shallow holes with their hands and bayonets, unable to move. Grant later admitted that the assault at Cold Harbor was his greatest mistake. He had violated his own mechanism. He had tried to force a frontal assault against a fortified position when he should have sidestepped, but he did not let the mistake paralyze him. He pulled his army back, crossed the James River, and moved south again. The sidestep continued. The campaign was a nightmare. The Union Army had lost over 50,000 men in less than 2 months. The morale of the soldiers was shattered. They had marched, fought, bled and died, and they were still not in Richmond. The public was in despair. The Confederate public was elated. Lee had held the line. He had inflicted massive casualties. He had proved that the Army of Northern Virginia was invincible. But Lee was also bleeding. He had lost 30,000 men, and he could not replace them. His army was getting smaller every day. Grant's army was getting reinforcements every week. The mathematical reality of the war was turning against the South. The final sidestep was the siege of Petersburg. Grant moved his army across the James River, bypassing Richmond entirely, and attacked the railroad junction at Petersburg. the supply hub for the Confederate capital. Lee, finally realizing that Grant was not going to retreat, was forced to rush his armies south to defend the city. The two armies settled into a network of trenches that stretched for miles. It was a precursor to the trench warfare of the First World War. Grant stretched his lines further and further to the west, forcing Lee to stretch his own lines thinner and thinner to cover the gaps. Lee did not have the men to hold the line. He was being bled dry. Grant's mechanism had worked. The continuous advance, the sidestep, the refusal to retreat, had locked Lee into a war of attrition that the Confederacy could not win. The siege of Petersburg lasted for 9 months. It was a brutal, grinding stalemate. The men lived in muddy trenches, sniped at by sharpshooters, and shelled by artillery. Grant launched a massive assault on the Confederate lines, but it failed, and the Union Army suffered heavy casualties. Grant also approved a plan to dig a tunnel under the Confederate lines and blow a massive mine. But the assault that followed was a disaster, and the Union soldiers were trapped in the crater, slaughtered by Confederate infantry. The public was in despair, but Grant did not stop. He kept stretching the line. He kept sending cavalry raids to tear up the Confederate railroads. He kept starving the Confederate army. In April of 1865, the Confederate lines finally broke. Lee was forced to abandon Petersburg and Richmond. He retreated west, hoping to link up with other Confederate forces in North Carolina. But Grant was in pursuit. The Union Army marched fast, light, and relentless. They outmarched the exhausted, starving Confederate army. Grant sent cavalry ahead to block the roads. Lee's army was surrounded at Appomattox Courthouse. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered his army to Grant. The terms were generous. Grant allowed the Confederate officers to keep their sidearms and their horses. He ordered his men to share their rations with the starving Confederate soldiers. He did not gloat. He did not punish. He simply ended the war. The most powerful army in the Confederacy was gone. The war was effectively over. The cost of the victory was staggering. The overland campaign and the siege of Petersburg had cost the Union Army over 70,000 casualties. The Confederate Army had lost over 40,000. The landscape of Virginia was scarred with trenches, forts, and graves. The victory at Appomattox did not end the war instantly. Other Confederate armies in the field would take weeks to surrender. But the capture of the Army of Northern Virginia was the decisive blow. The Confederate government was in flight, and the rebellion was collapsing. Grant's mechanism had won the war. The aftermath of the war was complex and painful. Grant was the most famous man in the United States. He was promoted to General of the Army, a 4-star rank created specifically for him. He was given a house in Washington. He was feted and celebrated across the country. But the nation was deeply wounded. President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated just days after the surrender at Appomattox. The new president, Andrew Johnson, was a Southern Democrat who wanted to reconcile with the South quickly, without protecting the rights of the newly freed slaves. Grant, who believed in the cause of the Union and the rights of the freedmen, found himself caught between Johnson and the radical Republicans in Congress. He was a soldier, not a politician. But he was drawn into the political maelstrom. Grant served as Secretary of War under Johnson for a time, but the two men clashed repeatedly. Johnson wanted to fire Grant, but Grant was too popular. The Republican Party saw Grant as their best chance to win the presidency in 1868. Grant was reluctant to run. He had never been interested in politics. But he believed that the country needed him. He ran for president and won easily. He served 2 terms from 1869 to 1877. His presidency was a mixed bag. He was a brilliant military commander, but he was a poor judge of character in politics. His administration was plagued by corruption scandals, though Grant himself was never implicated. He tried to protect the rights of African Americans in the South, using federal troops to suppress the Ku Klux Klan. But the country was tired of Reconstruction, and the political will to enforce civil rights eventually faded. After his presidency, Grant went on a world tour. He was greeted as a hero in Europe and Asia. He met with Queen Victoria, Otto von Bismarck, and the Emperor of Japan. He was treated as the most famous living American. But when he returned home, He found that his fortune had been wiped out by a corrupt business partner. Grant was broke again. He was forced to sell his medals and his souvenirs to pay his debts. He was diagnosed with throat cancer, a legacy of his lifelong habit of smoking cigars. He was in terrible pain, and he knew he was dying. His last battle was to write his memoirs. He wanted to provide for his wife and children. He wrote furiously, in constant agony, racing against death. He finished the manuscript just days before he passed away. The book was a masterpiece of clear, direct prose, and it sold hundreds of thousands of copies, restoring his family's fortune. Ulysses S. Grant passed away on July 23, 1885. His funeral was one of the largest in American history. Over 1 million people lined the streets of New York City to watch the procession. He was buried in a massive tomb on Riverside Drive, overlooking the Hudson River. The tomb was paid for by public donations, a testament to the respect and admiration that the American people had for the man who had saved the Union. The legacy of Ulysses S. Grant is complex. He was a man who failed at everything in peacetime. He was a drunk, a clerk, a failed farmer. But in war he was a genius. He understood the brutal industrial nature of the conflict better than anyone else. He did not fight a war of elegant maneuvers. He fought a war of relentless pressure, continuous advance, and total attrition. His mechanism was not glamorous. It was bloody, it was costly, and it was hard. But it worked. He never lost a campaign. He captured 3 armies. He defeated the Confederacy. He was the architect of total victory. The reputation of Grant has fluctuated wildly over the years. In the immediate aftermath of the war, he was hailed as a savior. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as the country reconciled with the South, the lost cause mythology took hold. Historians sympathetic to the South portrayed Grant as a butcher, a drunkard who won only because he had more men and more resources. Lee was elevated to the status of a demigod, a brilliant tactician who was overwhelmed by superior numbers. Grant was dismissed as a blunt instrument. But in recent decades, historians have rehabilitated Grant's reputation. They have recognized his strategic brilliance, his understanding of the totality of the war, and his unwavering commitment to the cause of emancipation. They have seen that his mechanism was not just brute force, but a sophisticated application of geography, logistics, and tempo. He was the first modern general, the man who understood that war is not a game of chess, but a clash of societies, and that the only way to win is to bring the full weight of your society to bear on the enemy. Ulysses S. Grant was a man who was broken by life and forged by war. He was a drunk who never lost a battle. He was a failure who saved the nation. His story is a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of clear thinking, and the brutal, necessary art of winning. The man who measured leather in Galena, Illinois, was the man who remade the map of North America. He was the drunk general who never lost a campaign. If this deep dive into the mechanics of military history gave you a new perspective, if you want to see more battles broken down by their geography and their human decisions, then let me know in the comments below. Tell me what commander you want me to cover next. I read every single comment, and I will see you on the next battlefield.